Hey guys, tonight we begin a story that most of the world has forgotten how to tell together. As we begin not with a king or a battle or a conquest, but with a garden. Because the word paradise itself comes from ancient Persia, Paradisa, a walled garden, a place where beauty is protected from the wilderness outside. Tonight we tell the story of the civilization that gave the world that word, that gave the world the idea that beauty is worth protecting, that built the first empire in human history and chose as its founding principle not conquest, but kindness. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight we explore the story of ancient Persia, the first light, together. If this is your first video here, take a look around, subscribe if it feels like home, and leave a comment your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. Before we speak of kings and armies and the vast machinery of empire, let us speak of the land itself. Because the land of Iran is not incidental to the story of Persian civilization. It is the story. The land shaped everything: the people, the culture, the religion, the poetry, the particular quality of beauty that Persian art has always carried and that no other tradition in the world has quite replicated. Iran sits at the center of the world in the most literal geographic sense. To the east, the mountains of Central Asia and the routes that lead to India and China. To the west, Mesopotamia, the ancient cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates. To the north, the Caspian Sea and the steppes. To the south, the Persian Gulf and the waters that connect to Arabia and Africa. This is not a marginal place. This is the place where everything meets. The Iranian plateau is vast and varied in a way that surprises those who have not seen it. There are deserts, the Dasht-e-Kavir and the Dasht-e-Lut, two of the driest places on earth. Salt flats that shimmer like water in the heat, landscapes of such absolute silence that they seem to exist outside of time. And there are mountains. The Alborz range in the north, where Damavand rises to nearly 6,000 meters. Its volcanic peak white with snow even in summer, visible from Tehran on clear days, like a god keeping watch over the plain below. And between the desert and the mountains, valleys. Green, irrigated, impossibly fertile. Places where water was coaxed from the earth through an ancient underground irrigation system called the qanat. Tunnels dug by hand through rock, carrying snowmelt from the mountains to the fields below, some of them still in use today after 3,000 years. The qanat is perhaps the most characteristic Persian invention, not the sword, not the palace, but the underground channel that brings water to where it is needed, patient, invisible, indispensable. A civilization that builds underground rivers to make the desert bloom is telling you something about itself. It is telling you that it understands that the most important things are often the things you cannot see. The story of Iranian civilization does not begin with the Persians. It begins much earlier, with a people called the Elamites, who built their civilization in the southwestern region of the Iranian plateau, in what is now the province of Khuzestan, in the river valleys where the Zagros Mountains meet the Mesopotamian plain. The Elamites were ancient when Babylon was young. Their capital was a city called Susa, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, settled as early as 4000 BCE. Susa sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, a point of contact between the civilizations of the Iranian plateau and those of Mesopotamia, a city that absorbed and synthesized influences from both worlds. What survives of Elamite civilization is fragmentary clay tablets, cylinder seals, the great ziggurat of Chogha-Zanbil, which still stands in the desert of Khuzestan, its ancient fired bricks baked by a sun that has not changed since the 14th century BCE, when the bricks were laid. The ziggurat of Chogha-Zanbil is worth pausing on. It was built by an Elamite king named Untash-Naparisha as a temple to the Elamite gods, a stepped pyramid of fired brick rising from the flat desert plain, surrounded by a succession of walled enclosures like the layers of a dream. It was never finished. The king died, the workers set down their tools, and the half-finished temple stood in the desert for 3,000 years, waiting. There is something in the image of the unfinished ziggurat standing patiently in the desert for 3,000 years that captures something essential about the Iranian relationship with time. Patience, endurance, the understanding that what is built with genuine intention does not disappear simply because the builder is gone. The Elamites rose and fell and rose again across nearly 3,000 years of history. They were conquered by the Akkadians and recovered. They were conquered by the Babylonians and recovered. They left their mark on the culture that came after them, in the language, in the artistic traditions, in the administrative systems that the Achaemenid Persians would later inherit and expand. They were the first flame. Before the great fire of Persian civilization was lit, the Elamites kept the ember burning. While the Elamites were building their civilization in the southwest, the peoples who would become the Persians and the Medes were moving. They were Indo-European peoples related to the tribes who would eventually produce the Greeks and the Romans and the Indians who had migrated from the Central Asian steppes onto the Iranian plateau sometime around 1500 BCE. They were pastoralists and warriors, skilled horsemen, organized in tribes and clans rather than cities. They learned. The Iranian plateau had been civilized for thousands of years before they arrived. The Elamites were already there. The influence of Mesopotamia, the oldest urban civilization in the world, was everywhere. And the new arrivals absorbed, adapted, synthesized. The Medes were the first of the Iranian peoples to build something that could be called a kingdom. Their heartland was in the northwest of the plateau, in the mountainous regions south of the Caspian Sea, with their capital at a city called Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, whose ruins still lie beneath the modern city. The Medes were extraordinary horsemen and fighters. Under their king, Cyaxares, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, they allied with the Babylonians and destroyed the Assyrian Empire, which had been the dominant military power of the ancient Near East for centuries. The Assyrians, who had terrorized the ancient world with their systematic cruelty, Their practice of impaling conquered peoples, of deporting entire populations, of destroying cities so thoroughly that nothing remained, was swept away. The world exhaled. Cyaxares built a Median empire that stretched from Anatolia to the borders of Central Asia. He organized the Persian army into the formations that would later make the Achaemenid armies the most formidable fighting force in the ancient world. He created the administrative framework that his successors would inherit and transform. He did not know that one of those successors would not be a Mede. Among the peoples subject to Median authority was a tribe called the Persians. They lived in the southwest of the plateau, in a region called Parsa, which the Greeks called Persis, which we call Persia. They were related to the Medes, spoke a similar language, shared similar customs, worshipped similar gods. One of their princes would change everything. His name was Cyrus. Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great, was born sometime around 600 BCE to the Persian royal house of the Achaemenids. He was, by every account available to us, extraordinary. Not in the way that many ancient rulers were extraordinary, not through brutality, not through divine favor, not through the sheer force of military conquest alone, but through something rarer, something that the ancient world had almost no name for: wisdom. Cyrus understood something that most of the rulers before him had not understood, and most of the rulers after him would forget almost immediately. That an empire built on fear is always on the verge of collapse. That people who are conquered and humiliated will always revolt when the opportunity arises. That the cost of maintaining control through terror is always, ultimately, greater than the benefits of the control itself. And that there is another way. In 550 BCE, Cyrus revolted against the Median king Astyages, who was, by most accounts, not a man who inspired great loyalty in those around him. The Median army, encountering Cyrus's forces, largely switched sides. Astyages was captured. Cyrus treated him with respect. He was not executed. He was given a comfortable retirement. This was not the ancient Near Eastern way. The ancient Near Eastern way was the way of the Assyrians: conquest, deportation, destruction. The way of the Babylonians, who had displayed the heads of their enemies on the city walls. The way of a world organized around the principle that power demonstrates itself through the capacity for violence. Cyrus did something different. He kept going. He conquered Lydia, the wealthy kingdom of Asia Minor, whose king Croesus was famous for his riches and his confidence, and his terrible misjudgment of the situation. He conquered the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, and then, in 539 BCE, he turned his attention to Babylon, the greatest city in the world, the center of the ancient Near East, a city that had stood for 2,000 years. He conquered it without a battle, not through magic, not through divine intervention, but because the people of Babylon, who had been living under a king named Nabonidus, who was, by all accounts, not particularly interested in governing, preferring instead to pursue his religious obsessions in a city in Arabia, were willing to open the gates. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he entered it not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He left the temples standing. He respected the local gods. He restored what had been displaced. And he issued a document. The Cyrus Cylinder is a small baked clay object approximately 9 inches long, covered in cuneiform script. It was discovered in 1879 by a British museum expedition in the ruins of Babylon and is now housed in London. It is, by any measure, one of the most important objects in the history of human civilization. In the inscription on the cylinder, Cyrus describes his entry into Babylon and his policy toward the peoples he has conquered. He declares that he has freed all peoples who were being held in captivity in Babylon, including the Jews, who had been in Babylonian captivity since Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE. He declares that he will allow all peoples to worship their own gods. He declares that he will not oppress anyone. The United Nations keeps a replica of the Cyrus Cylinder in its headquarters in New York. It is described as the world's first charter of human rights. There is debate about this characterization. Scholars argue about whether the cylinder represents a genuine philosophical commitment to human rights or a piece of political propaganda designed to legitimize Cyrus's conquest. This debate, though interesting, perhaps misses something. Because whether or not Cyrus was a philosopher king who had genuinely worked out a theory of human dignity, whether or not his motivations were pure, the fact remains that he behaved as if human dignity mattered. And in a world where the alternative was Assyrian impalement and Babylonian captivity, behavior is what people actually live inside. The Jews who walked out of Babylon and returned to Jerusalem did not much care whether Cyrus's motivations were philosophically pure. They called him the Anointed One. They wrote about him in the book of Isaiah as a shepherd chosen by God. He was the first non-Jewish figure in history to receive that designation. He was a Persian. Cyrus died in battle in 530 BCE, fighting on the eastern frontier of his empire. The manner of his death is uncertain. The ancient sources disagree. What is not uncertain is what he left behind. An empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. A model of governance built on tolerance and respect for local customs. And a standard against which every subsequent Persian king would be measured, and most of them, being human, would fall short. Cyrus's successors, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, and the kings who followed them, expanded and elaborated what Cyrus had begun. The Achaemenid Empire, at its greatest extent, under Darius the Great, stretched from modern Greece to modern Pakistan, from modern Egypt to modern Kazakhstan. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. And it was built, administered, and expressed through beauty. Darius built a new ceremonial capital at a place called Parsa, which the Greeks called Persepolis, the city of Persia. It was not a military fortress. It was not a commercial center. It was a statement. Persepolis was built on a great terrace of stone, accessible by a monumental double staircase whose steps were shallow enough to be climbed on horseback. At the top of the staircase were the propylaea, the gateway, flanked by enormous bulls with human heads looking outward across the plain. Inside the terrace were the great halls. The Apadana, the audience hall of Darius, was a forest of columns, each more than 20 meters tall, topped with double-headed bull capitals. The walls were lined with carved stone reliefs, showing the peoples of the empire bringing tribute to the king, not in chains, not in humiliation, but in procession, each people shown in their own distinctive dress, carrying their own distinctive gifts. Babylonians with a humped bull, Egyptians with a vase, Lydians with golden vessels, Indians with donkeys and gold dust. 67 different peoples represented in stone, each one specific, each one dignified. This is the artistic vision of an empire that understood itself differently from its predecessors. Not a machine for extraction, not a system for humiliation, but a gathering of peoples, each contributing what they uniquely had to offer. The vision was not always matched by the reality. Empires being what they are, the gap between the ideal and the practice was substantial. But the vision itself was real. Someone had to imagine it before it could be carved in stone. And what gets carved in stone tells you what a civilization believes is worth preserving.
Persian architecture at Persepolis, Susa, and Pasargadae, Cyrus's original capital, where his simple tomb still stands in an empty plain. A small stone structure of extraordinary dignity, was the architecture of a civilization that had thought carefully about what it wanted to say to the world and to the future. It wanted to say, "We are here. We are vast. We are various. And we are beautiful." Running beneath and through everything in Persian civilization, the empire, the art, the administration, the poetry that would come later, was a religious tradition unlike anything else in the ancient world. Zoroastrianism. The prophet Zoroaster, Zarathustra in the ancient Iranian language, lived sometime between 1500 and 600 BCE, the dates being a matter of considerable scholarly disagreement. He lived on the Iranian plateau, possibly in the northeast, in a world of cattle herders and warriors and the old Iranian gods. And he had a vision. The vision was not of a pantheon of gods competing and interfering with human affairs in the manner of the Greeks or the Mesopotamians. It was of a single principle of good, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, in cosmic struggle with a single principle of evil, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. The universe was the arena of this struggle, and human beings were not spectators, they were participants. Every thought, every word, every action was either a contribution to the good or a contribution to the evil. The choice was always available. The responsibility was always present. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Humata, hukta, huvarshta. This is the entire moral teaching of Zoroastrianism compressed into 3 words. And it is a teaching of extraordinary elegance, because it makes ethics not a matter of ritual or sacrifice or the appeasement of divine powers, but a matter of daily practice, of what you think when you wake up, of what you say when you speak, of what you do with your hands. The sacred fire of Zoroastrianism, the fire that burns in Zoroastrian temples and has burned continuously in some of them for 1500 years, is not worshipped as a god. It is understood as a symbol, a representation of the light of Ahura Mazda, of the divine intelligence that illuminates the darkness. But there is something in the image of the sacred fire, burning through conquest and collapse, through the coming of Alexander and the coming of Islam and the passage of centuries, that is more than symbolic. It is the image of something that refuses to go out. Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism during the Babylonian captivity and through Judaism influenced Christianity and Islam. The concepts of heaven and hell, of a final judgment, of the cosmic struggle between good and evil, of an end of time when good will triumph, all of these entered the Western religious tradition through the contact between Judaism and Persian civilization. We are all, in this sense, children of Zoroaster. I want to rest here for a moment before the Greeks arrive and everything changes, because what Achaemenid Persia built across 2 centuries of empire from Cyrus to the last Darius was not simply a political entity. It was a way of thinking about the world. The idea that the diversity of humanity is not a problem to be solved, but a richness to be honored. The idea that good governance means leaving people enough of their own life to live it. The idea that beauty is not a luxury, but a form of truth. The idea that the flame of human dignity, once lit, is worth any amount of effort to keep burning. These are not inevitable ideas. Most of the empires that came before and after Achaemenid Persia did not hold them. The Assyrians did not hold them. Rome, for all its greatness, held them only partially and inconsistently. Many empires in the subsequent history of the world have not held them at all. The fact that these ideas existed, that someone in the ancient world not only thought them, but built an empire on them, carved them in stone at Persepolis for anyone who came after to read, is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. Tonight, in whatever darkness you are lying in, the idea of Cyrus is still in the air. The idea that power exercised with wisdom is more durable than power exercised with fear. The idea that the people who are different from you are not threats, but gifts. The idea that a garden, a walled, tended, beautiful garden, is the closest thing to paradise that human hands can make. The Persians put that idea into the world, and the world has never quite forgotten it, even when it tries. I want to speak very slowly now to whoever is still listening. In the ruins of Persepolis, which Alexander burned in 330 BCE, an act he apparently regretted almost immediately, the columns still stand. Not all of them. 13 columns of the Apadana Audience Hall, rising above the plain of Marv Dasht in the province of Fars, visible for miles in every direction. They have been standing for 2,500 years. They were standing when Alexander burned the palace around them. They were standing when the Parthians replaced the Achaemenids. They were standing when the Sasanians replaced the Parthians. They were standing when the Arab armies swept across Persia in the 7th century and the world changed utterly. They are standing tonight. There is a particular quality to the light in the late afternoon at Persepolis, the sun moving toward the mountains in the west, the columns casting long shadows across the stone terrace, the carved reliefs still visible in the stone, the peoples of the empire still walking in their procession, still carrying their gifts, still present in the rock as if the parade had just that moment ended. Rumi, who would live nearly 2,000 years after Persepolis was built, who would write his poetry in a language that did not exist when the columns were carved, said something that applies to these ruins with a precision that seems impossible across the distance of centuries. He said that what you are looking for is what is looking. The light that falls on the columns of Persepolis tonight is the same light that fell on them when Darius the Great walked through his audience hall. The stars above the Iranian plateau tonight are the stars that Zoroaster read for signs of the wise Lord's presence. The mountains are the same mountains, and somewhere in the underground qanat channels beneath the desert floor of Iran, water is still moving, still carrying the snowmelt from the mountains to the fields below, still invisible, still indispensable, still doing what it has done for 3,000 years. The garden is still there. It was always there. Let your breathing slow. Let the columns stand in the dark behind your eyes. Let the sacred fire, which has never quite gone out, warm the room you are in. And rest. Tonight, you have been to the beginning of something. If this reached you tonight, leave a comment, just your city and the time. This is part 1 of the Iran trilogy. Part 2, the story of what happened when the world came for Persia and what Persia did about it, is coming. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Monday and Thursday, same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.